right, so we'll start. So today, I thought that I'll start with this topic of about the financialization, and this financialization is a very crucial aspect of the neoliberalism after 1980s, or the period which is also characterized by what we are calling post-Fordism. We have seen that in the post-Fordist literature, we studied neo-Schumpeterian approach. We also studied the neo-Smithian approach. And both these approaches actually lacked one thing, and that is the overemphasis on technology or overemphasis on the market actually meant that one very crucial aspect about capitalism, that how the finance is actually behaving and what are the rules of the games as far as the finance is concerned, how they have changed, because that has a very important impact on the way the world capitalism has been evolving. The point is that it is the way capitalism evolves is not simply about the technology, or it's not simply about the market and how the market actually changes, and how what are the ways in which one could respond to that market, and what are the ways in which actually people respond to it. What are the ways in which you respond to technology? Technological change. What are the ways in which you respond to the changes that has taken place in the market? That itself depends a lot on the organizational structure and the financial controls, because at the end of it, whether it is the innovation or it is any kind of opportunity which is thrown by the market, whether which one will be adopted will really depend on the financial interest and the benefits that it actually is able to deliver to the existing organizations, which are going to be powerful, whether it is the corporations or they are going to be the financial institutions. So when we think of the neo-Marxist approach, which actually gives a scope to actually study these things, and by giving a scope does not mean that it necessarily will get it right, but at least you recognize that there is a very important issue that is involved here. So the finance is something which is important, and when we think of the mode of regulation which actually gives rise to a particular regime of accumulation under capitalism, then naturally in that mode of regulation, the crucial question comes that what is happening to the financial sector. What I will do is that there are multiple ways in which the financial sector changes and overall impact on the economy can be discussed. So I will try and actually parallelly give you all the perspective. I mean, not all, but at least different perspective, in the sense that we will talk about how the finance is changing. We will talk about how is the macroeconomic policies are changing, domestic macroeconomic policies are changing. We'll talk about how is the globalization evolving in terms of trade and investment. We'll talk about what is the international monetary system that is evolving, because essentially you have the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 70s. So a new international monetary system, how is that evolving? Because all these things, and at the same time, what is happening to the remember under Fordism, one of the reasons that why you offered higher wages, one of the reasons, not the only reason, was that you wanted to politically control your working class. So now what happens that now that you do not have the threat of the socialism that existed in the post-Second World War period. By 80s, socialism, socialist countries are on decline, and that is very clear. By the late 80s, in fact, there is a complete collapse of those states. But does that mean that the workers can be, or the working class in the United States can be completely ignored? Or if not, then what is happening? So all these things are something which has to be in some sense linked and discussed together. After all, if one is talking of the one world, you can have different theorizations, but if those theorizations are correct, and theorizations are partial, theorizations are never complete. But if those are the correct theorization of this world, even if they are partial, then one has to see the complementarity between those theorizations, whether it is the macroeconomic theorization or the theory of the financial, the policies which actually are based on the ideas of financial deregulations and so on and so forth. So this is what we intend to discuss now. If I talk about the readings that are there in your reading list, there is one compulsory reading, and that is by Richard Dore, and that's a very simple reading, and that really does not talk much about it. Really talks about more about, the emphasis is more about that how the finance becomes important and to what extent this financialization has impacted the society. I mean, people's behavior and everything has changed, and also the fact that in the society, the hierarchy that you have in economy and society, that has changed. How you have the differential wages between the top management and the working class, that differences has been exponentially growing during this period. Those things are indicated, but it really does not try to link it the way I was mentioning right now. So we'll go a little beyond what is there in our reading, because that's something which is very, very important. Some of you who have done Political Economy 1 course must have done one article by, who was this person? University of Hyderabad. Uh, uh, I'm forgetting his name. Political Economy 1. What was your article on the global finance? Anyone remembers?
Vamsi, Vamsi.
Once. So, yeah, it is Wamsi's article. Wamsi's article is good. It is quite simple. The only thing is that it unnecessarily, I think, tries to explain things in terms of the Marxian economics, which to my mind is not necessary at all. Not that what he is saying is incorrect, but one can actually look at without referring to Marxism. But Wamsi is a good reading otherwise. There is one more reading by Stockhammer, which I downloaded today. I mean, I didn't have the soft copy of it. I do not know whether, because that's not a compulsory reading. So if you don't have it, I will send it to you. It's interesting. As a matter of fact, I would propose that let me actually talk about the overall thing, and then possibly some of you can make a presentation on both Richard Dore and the Stockhammer's article. So please do think about it and let me know if you flip through the article, and if you think that you would want to present it, then that would be quite nice. And let me know about it. What is then story that we will be actually telling? Look at the situation just before 1980. I mean, 1980 is when, early 80s, when both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher come to power in USA and UK respectively. Both are in some sense symbolize the supply side economics. Not that the opposition parties, that is the Democratic Party and the Labour Party in UK, they might have been or in opposition to those policies which were adopted by these people, but later they were adopted by the opposition parties also. So in some sense, one can say that these two people symbolize the beginning of an era. Now, what is the situation in 1980? Bretton Woods has collapsed. Bretton Woods has collapsed. There is a stagnation in the Western world. stagnation that we have actually talked about in quite detail. There is unemployment. Keynesian demand management does not seem to be working. Whenever it is attempted, it is leading to inflation, giving rise to this whole idea of stagflation, which has been discussed in the macroeconomics, which actually made its way in macroeconomic textbook, the whole idea of stagflation. And so this is the situation. Mass market has actually completely stagnated. And there is a realization that now that Asian economies are getting industrialized, so first it was Japan after Second World War, and then now, by now early 80s, it is clear that the East Asian economies are truly the emerging economies. Then, and their cost of production is quite low. And if the cost of in China, it starts with 1983. And I would not say that until the late 80s, China is actually noticed in a big way that it is an emerging industrial power. But East Asian economies were. East Asian economies, particularly these four East Asian tigers, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong, in which clearly the South Korea, both because of its size and because of its dynamism, remained the most important. So now that there is this realization that you can't compete, you have to basically think of that, how you're going to react. And one of the reaction that is there, and that was something which was adopted, is what we know as the supply side economics. But before we get into the supply side economics, let us spend some time over what was the status of the financial sector then. We know that the post-Second World War, the financial sector was heavily regulated. Partly because of the historical reason, the Great Depression was essentially a crisis which emerged in the financial sector. So that hangover was still there post-Second World War, when the new dealers actually formulated a new world, a new mode of regulation was established. And secondly, that when you look at the Keynesian economic framework, then there are certain things which actually go with it. Remember, it is the ultimate aim of the Keynesian policy framework is to maintain full employment, have high investment, high capacity utilization, high output, high employment, and if that is so, and if the finance is seen as a source of trouble, the source which can be destabilizing, then naturally there would be actually check on finance. And that check was there in the sense that the financial sector, which after all it is capitalism, so whoever has invested money in these corporations, would naturally the profits would go to them. But what they could do with profit was seriously restricted. And which means that the impact is that you have the accumulation of profit. You have the huge accumulation of profit because of almost 2 to 3 decades run of 2 to 2.5 decades of growth, sustained growth. You have huge accumulation of profit. And so, this finance is basically looking for the avenues for investment. And clearly, given the size of the advanced capitalist market, and more than the size of the advanced capitalist market, it is basically your the world, the competition from the Asian economies, that you realize that this investment has to actually flow globally. Otherwise, there is not much avenues for investment if one looks at only domestically. So that is the world that we are there in. And in this world, then what is actually how things are, how things will actually be shaped. And this shaping up the first thing that is worth mentioning here is the supply side economics. And supply side economics does two things essentially. We have earlier talked about it, but I'll just mention some points and try and get to the finance because that's something which should be our focus right now. But the supply side economics essentially says that any attempt of the demand management by the government is basically will lead to inflation, or it will lead to the crowding out, or it will lead to the structural rigidities in the economy. Essentially, you're not allowing the market to work and so on and so forth because of the government intervention, government spending. So basically, the government must have the minimum presence, and essentially when you have that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at the same thing is that if the government is actually spending money, then it has to raise the revenue. If it is not raising revenue, then it will print money. If it is not printing money, then it will actually borrow from the people. Either way, someone has to actually bear this cost, and which means that the cost of production in the economy is going to go up. And if the cost of production in the economy is going to go up, you lose your competitiveness, and anyway you are at a disadvantage with the Asian economies because of the higher wages. And on top of that, if you actually have a policy which leads to the higher cost of production, then there is no way that you can actually survive. So essentially, you have to go for the low government expenditure. The maintaining competitiveness also means that the tax rates have to be lower. And all policies which you can think of which is going to reduce the cost of production were advocated. So naturally, one of the first thing that happens is basically dismantling the trade union. So the various gains that trade unions had made in the pre-Second World War period. Remember, the pre-Second World War period is a period where the trade union struggle is actually taking place, and it is the post-Second World War is the period when those struggles of the trade unions and the other global and the local political context meant that you have truly the working class actually benefited from capitalism in a big way. Now it is a time to actually take that back, because that is actually increasing your cost of production. The political compulsion of paying higher wages to check the socialist ideas, the communist ideas, is also gradually diminishing. And so it is not thought that this is something which is important for the political stability of the system. So dismantling the trade union was one of the first goals. You also have dismantling various other kinds of services, the health services and so on, essentially what we call the social component of wages. Am I audible to all of you? Anyone who can't listen to me very clearly? Should I assume that I'm audible? Is that fine?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Because it was fine. Anyway, so this is where you enter in the supply side economics. But remember, there is this other thing also, and that is the finance. And by the way, I was talking. Let me finish that point about dismantling, essentially reducing the social component of the wages. So the private wages are paid by the firms. So social wages are provided by the government, essentially in terms of free education or health and other kinds of things. But then someone has to pay for that. It is not that that is coming for the economy. It is free. So I'll not get into the mechanism. Most of you are familiar with those mechanisms, but in case there is a confusion, we can discuss it later. So what you have is that you want to actually reduce social component of wages, which leads to the dismantling of the funding to the health services, funding to the education and so on in a big way. And this particularly happens in United Kingdom more than actually USA. As a matter of fact, the only country which was successfully resisted it to happen is actually amongst the big economies was actually Germany. But otherwise, this was something which happened on a big scale in most of the economies. In US anyway, you did not have much in health services, much public health services, but in terms of the education, the presence of the government has been immense in the United States. I mean, that's remarkable actually, both the school education and the university education. But what you see post 1980 is that there has been a gradual withdrawal of resources, primarily from the higher education, but not only that, but also from the school education and so on, which then has an impact on the social mobility. That if you actually privatize education, if you make education costly, then a lot of people who have the capability to move ahead if they get proper education, but they do not have that kind of economic background, never get the chance. So the social mobility is something which has declined during this period. But anyway, that is the after effect. What you see there is that there is a decline in wages. Now, so this is something which is happening, and remember, you have the lot of finance which is available, which is looking for the avenues of investment globally, which means that globally also this kind of supply side economics is propagated. Because if you go and invest in some country, then you would want the tax regime, you would want the wages to be low, you would want the tax regimes to be favorable, and so on. So throughout the world, this was something which is propagated. One question that comes in that, okay, fine, it's true that by late 70s, the late 60s, early 70s, the Keynesian economic policy was not working. But does that mean that the problem of effective demand went away? Of course, it did not go away. What was then, and in that context, if you are trying to sell the supply side economics, and supply side economics, remember, in some sense, it appears like, if you take it to be derived from the monetarist economics, or what you studied as the classical economics, rather unfortunate term, then you see that essentially you assume full employment in that analysis, and you are basically assuming away the effective demand problem completely. So if you're assuming away effective demand problem completely, and then actually devising your policy on the basis of that, the policies of lower wages, the policies of low tax rates, and so on, then what if you get into the effective demand problem? And there the argument of the supply side economics, and here you see that it is actually being practical. It is not as headstrong as the monetarist theory, which insists on full employment, or eventually the economy is gravitating towards full employment. Rather than that, what you see is this idea was encouraged, that if you have the low cost of production, then you would be able to export, and the export as the source of demand is there. So that is something which is there in mind. I mean, so people like Manmohan Singh and so on, they were stopped claiming that they were Keynesian. Remember, Manmohan Singh had studied in Cambridge, almost from the same teachers that Professor Amit Bhaduri or Prabhat Patnaik had studied. So he did not come from the American school. He comes from that British post-Keynesian school. But then there is this thought, but he also went to IMF for some years, worked with IMF, and I think his perspective changes. And then you think that, okay, fine, we realize that there is a problem of demand, but then, If the demand is something which is managed by higher government expenditure, then all kinds of distortions come in the economy. But if you actually try and reduce your cost of production, increase your competitiveness, and try and export more, then this export-based growth is going to be a much more robust thing. So that is something which is, this is an idea which is recognized. So you see, the supply side economics is not in complete denial of the fact that you can have the effective demand problem. It's just that it does not accept the Keynesian solution to that. It actually accepts more of a monetarist kind of approach towards the policy. So supply side economics, in that sense, is it's a real world monetarism which actually does not shy away. It does not. There is no need for to maintain that theoretical purism and say that the demand problem is not there at all, as the monetarists would do. So this is the thing, that the export-led growth is something which is here. Now the export-led growth also dependent on the fact the it also encourages the idea that you should have as much of the foreign direct investment as possible, because it is essentially FDI would mean that your competitiveness will increase, your labor productivity will increase, your cost of production will be lower, and very practically speaking, FDI also means that your exports will increase, because after all, as we have discussed earlier, that most of the exports are done by from the developing economies. If things are imported, then those things are manufactured and imported or leased out, outsourced, and then imported by the corporations themselves. So the fact that if you can have the multinational corporations investing in your economy, that will be good for your exports also. When this argument actually comes in the newspapers and so on, as that if you actually allow the Walmart, then that is going to encourage the craftsmen in India and so on, because it will provide a global market to them. So more FDI, more FDI, but why would you get more FDI if your wages are high? So you try and make sure that you have labor reforms. Why would you have your FDI if your tax rates are high? So you try and have the lower corporate profit tax rate. By the way, all these policies, the lower wages, dismantling of the trade union activities, having the labor reforms, which does not actually put any kind of pressure on employer in terms of hire and fire, all these things, and the lower corporate tax rate, all these things are actually beneficial for the local industrialists also. And if it is beneficial for the local industrialists, then the biggest spokespersons of this kind of the policy which would actually attract FDI are actually the local bourgeoisie, the local industrialists, big industries, because they know that if the government actually undertakes the policy to get more FDI, essentially it is benefiting them also. So on the one hand, you are opening up, so the opening up should have actually threatened the local capitalist, and it did threaten local capitalists. It is not that it did not threaten, because they thought that now they have to compete globally, and otherwise they will not survive. But they could also see that benefits are much more. Benefits in the sense that of the lower wages, lower tax rates, and other kinds of, lower tax rates and subsidies are actually the same thing. The argument that the lower tax rates essentially reduces your cost of production, it increases your profitability, but so does the subsidies of all kinds. So, if you have lower tax rates, then it also makes sense to give subsidized infrastructure and so on. So this is the kind of economics which is adopted throughout the world, and this is something which is considered to be very, very, which is definitely helping the finances, the people who control finances, people who benefit from the finances in the advanced capitalist countries. So clearly, the class interest and the assertion of the class interest that we were talking about, that were in the United States, when we talked of the class in the in the 20th century, from the very beginning of the 20th century, or from the end of the 19th century itself, the class that emerges, in which at the top you have the class of the financiers, and then the middle class or the managerial class, and then the masses. In that, there is a comeback of the financial class, something which remained at top, but there was a marginalization of that class. There was a more of a what is called the left kind of alliance between the masses and the managerial class, aided and supported by the state, and the top class, which remained the richest class, nevertheless was marginalized. Now they make an assertion. So every crisis then in the system is an opportunity for any class to assert itself with its interests. So it could be then a leftward movement, or it could be a rightward movement. So currently, if you have this COVID-19 crisis, that may lead to more democratization of our societies, or it may actually lead to a complete authoritarian regimes coming all over the world. So that's a real possibility, because there is a crisis, and eventually you say that certain fundamental changes are required to manage that crisis. Now, which way does it go is not something which we can prejudge. That really depends on a whole lot of other things. So I think we have 2 minutes. I will stop there, and we'll resume after that in a while, in 2-3 minutes. All right. Please think of some question if you have, then I will address those questions.